Hi, I'm Dori Griffin. I teach and learn contested design histories as an associate professor at the University of Florida School of Art and Art History, a politically charged location in our current Pluriverse. I first taught design history in 2010. Since then, I've worked to situate emergent practitioners in relationship to our disciplinary narratives. I want students to evaluate sources critically, to move past algorithm-driven inspiration, and to understand that design's historical landscapes hold many meanings. By teaching students to approach context with respectful curiosity, I hope to inform their collaborations as practitioners with diverse people. People are complicated. We change together over place, time, and culture, and we're located individually within our own intersectional positionality, with many thanks to Kimberly Crenshaw for giving us that word. So, my central question is, how might I frame design's many histories through encounters that expand students' capacity for contextual, respectful, diverse human collaborations? Today's landscape is very different from the one I entered as a teacher in 2010, and I'd point you to my article for the literature review undergirding this work. A quick reminder that Eskildsen in 2007 and Drucker and McVeris in 2008 were new additions to the American pedagogical landscape at the time. They followed Philip Meggs' groundbreaking 1983 survey, the first design history textbook that I read way back in Y2K. Some educators today assume that radical pluriversal historical pedagogy can be a given. Others still teach straight through Meggs. My experience suggests that the former group relies a great deal on lots of invisible labor undertaken by many teachers in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I'm telling my story through paired historical images rooted in Heinrich Waffelin's paired lantern slide lecture method, a pioneering design technology choice at the turn of the 20th century. Each image pair will ask a question, prompting us to reflect on design's production and use and its ongoing storytelling. I apply historical and visual document analysis from visual anthropology and material history. I also narrate my experiential teaching praxis, intentional feminist labor, and networked encounters with people that expansive histories always rely on. Over 15 plus years at 4 public universities in the USA, I've been a small part of graphic design history's efforts to grow as a discipline. As Fry, Dilno, and Stewart wrote in Design and the Question of History in 2015, understanding design as a shaper of worlds. We posit history as the generational site of the future. As a public university student at the turn of the millennium, I never took a course called Graphic Design History because it didn't exist. Yet I learned to deeply value a disciplinary history that we would now label canonical. Expanding that concept helped me engage critically with race, class, gender, and disability as factors in design's creation and use. Imperialism, settler colonialism, misogyny, eugenics, and institutionalized slavery have informed many design practices and economies. Some histories are contested, a reality that I face every day as a public educator in Florida. But I've always argued that we expand our discipline through additive work. It is vital to see and to interrogate both positive, recuperative historical designs and negative examples of bad human decision making rendered concrete and lasting through design. So let's see some images. I fell passionately in love with Beatrice Ward as a Typography 1 student when we read The Crystal Goblet. Over time, I recognized how canonical histories were partial and prejudicial beyond gender, but Ward was my first aha moment about what I wanted to be when I grew up. It made me livid that a male pseudonym was required for Ward to publish her historical research on the Garamond typeface, Paul Beaujean, 1926. Before I move on from this slide, while we're talking about women's contributions to design, I'd point you to a much more positive note. My former student, Dina Ben Rahim, has published her work for my class a couple of times. She explored women's positionality in historical design landscapes of the USA, and I encourage you to look her up on Alphabets. Historically, though, how has design rendered women's labor invisible? Our stories have been marginalized, and I would argue that we should recover them through historical research with attention to intersectional positionality. Emily Faithfull's Victoria Press was a printing trade school for girls and women in London, and it offers us a chance to discuss class and women's need to work at fair wages. As the 2019 AIGA Design Census showed, gender-based pay and position title discrepancies persist, and of course, race remains a significant barrier for many Black designers in the USA, regardless of gender. The hashtag tradwife of Instagram reminds me daily that understanding women's work in design historical context remains vital. The first time I taught design history, about 25% of my students were Latino or Latina, so I turned to Latin America for more examples of working women. I found El Peru Ilustrado, directed by Clorinda Mato de Turner, the first female editorial director in the Americas. Racialized and gendered stereotypes persisted under her guidance despite her lifelong feminist and indigenous activism. This highlights the systemic nature of inequity. How might we understand Matthew de Turner's contribution to the design historical record in a nuanced and critical way? How have humans designed effective environmental advertising? As I reflect on this question with students, I like to keep in mind that it's a global question and the answers we see can be useful to our praxis. In 2010, then student Robert Finkel researched arrows as a typographic form, and he later published that research with the American Printing History Association, so please look him up. His research pointed him to the world's first documented advertisement, environmental wayfinding carved into Ephesus's marble road in the first century. The footprint literally points the way, and the indeterminate portrait off to the right offers opportunities to discuss the social construction of gender. A 2009 tire repair shop in Brazil, conversely, offers a chance to discuss letter forms as craft and creative reuse as a design concept emerging from the global south. The specificity of these designs in response to their different contexts allows us to think about how design practitioners need to understand context quite deeply in order to collaborate effectively. How do networks impact the design and transmission of graphic knowledge? Networks can be diffuse, they can be invisible, they can be physical, and of course, connections always inform our work as designers. Early global knowledge networks and movable type predate Gutenberg significantly. I'd like to offer a blushing thank you to the Asian American student who asked me why we weren't seeing the Jikji in class. It's the first book printed with movable metal type in Korea in 1377. Of course, we looked at it the next day with an acknowledgement of my ignorance, and it's been in my lectures ever since. Meanwhile, the first known book printed with movable wooden type was this Chinese agricultural treatise from 1313. This page from that book shows the worship of international trade deities. The Eurocentric concept of a dark ages erases a flourishing world's trade network. Next, the classical medical text De Materia Medica was first translated into Persian in the 8th century. This 13th century manuscript copy shows how graphic languages evolved as they traveled along global trade routes. It also puts light to the stereotype that Arabic or Islamic texts can't have figural illustration. Both texts document design environments and human behaviors within them. So they're valuable not only as examples of texts, but as evidence of environmental design too. How do maps inform our embodied experiences? Here, it's important to acknowledge that the category of map defines how we understand mapping as an activity. There are many ways to think about maps and mapping. How might we be respectively curious about those many ways of approaching this design activity? Indigenous mapping raises questions of design and land sovereignty, decolonization in its literal land back definition. Here I'd like to acknowledge colleagues Cindy Tekobi and Johnson Mahira and designers Sadie Redwing and Saki Mafundikwa. They are all part of why I ask with students who owns the land, who determines how it is represented or how it is used. Maps of Africa immediately prompt these questions, and positionality really matters. Teaching in Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, and Ohio, I've seen in my students' lives how Africa and Africans become rhetorically charged. So when I teach, I seek an expansive hashtag own voices approach to African design. The Dogon cosmology map approaches embodied experience differently to a Cartesian map. It incorporates time, afterlife, and spiritual dimensions into everyday spatial representation. An African National Congress poster from the 20th century operationalizes a simplified Cartesian view toward self-determined political ends. I want diverse experiences and viewpoints to be represented by the groups of artifacts we see in class. Many students don't intuitively include spatial and temporal environments in their definition of graphic design. So these African mapping practices can expand that view as well. What is news and how does design shape its meanings? Here it's important to acknowledge the complicated nature of truth value and also the difficulty of accepting variability and human difference as part of a pluriversal approach. In 2016, news became a newly charted subject of political debate once more. In this context, I wanted to prompt conversations about how the form of news might impact its received meanings. The Lubok is an illustrated news sheet common to Russia since the mid-18th century. This is the first one I saw on a public domain review blog. And the Kawa is a Japanese illustrated news sheet circulated since the early 17th century. These forms argue that our way of doing things isn't the only right way. As we engage the diverse graphic languages of news in the classroom, we ask, what's newsworthy? Whose perspective is represented? How do formal decisions impact meaning? And how do news outlets convey graphic legitimacy? News is contested in today's design landscape, and it's important to understand how different our human ideas about news can be, and how the design of a document can impact its perceived truth value. How do user decisions shape print culture? Here, I really try to concentrate with students on the big difference between inspo pics and intersectional context. Coptic, Islamic, Korean, Chinese, Indonesian, and Hindi texts, among others, can move us before and beyond typography. And thank you to the students from those places who have shared their own cultural heritages with me. I've observed over time that most students enjoy studying Japanese design regardless of their own heritage, possibly because they love anime. As a Hello Kitty superfan, I kind of sympathize. So Japanese design offers us an opportunity to interrogate inspiration, appropriation, and respectful curiosity. We don't always design for people who are exactly like us. Designers must be curious about, quote, other people. So we practice building a personal visual literature review through encounters with Japanese print culture. We read about commercial book publishing in the Edo period and kimono catalogs during Art Nouveau. One central question becomes how we can read Japanese printed books without excessive comparison to Western European and North American models. An accessible route into this thorny question is often looking at how Japanese men might be portraying Japanese women, both for other Japanese men and for female Japanese kimono customers. I want students to encounter this print culture on its own terms, using landmarks from their own experiences fairly sparingly. When we ask why block printing was used for producing Edo-Japanese books, for instance, it certainly wasn't because Japanese printers didn't know about movable metal type. So we reflect on how our questions might be different when we don't assume that our own experiences are universal or our own design languages are the best. Whose authority does design recognize? This is a question of authorship, of juxtaposing different kinds of authorship to help reveal this element of design and probe this question of authority. Narratives of progress often mask settler colonial violence. Thank you to my mentor and colleague Maria Rogal for introducing me to the scholarship of the Global South, starting with a 2004 study trip to Mexico. Here, I juxtapose a German image maker's early 19th century anthropological work in Brazil with a 1975 Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture report. Both depict agricultural landscape inventions. These are design actions. Rogundus's image assumes white male control over indigenous black and brown bodies, while the Relatorio Agricola suggests a more collaborative social structure, perhaps using a little bit of extra imagination. These images document different collective design narratives that are being enacted on the same national landscape. Relatedly, what can bureaucratic design tell us? This question also asks us to consider authorship and agency, as well as very difficult historical circumstances. We will be looking at the question of human trafficking. Chris Lee's important book Immutable, which I reviewed for Designing Culture in 2024, argues that states exert and maintain political power through bureaucratic design. Students and I examined this fascinating argument through the Atlantic slave trade. I begin with evidence of Africa's flourishing social and commercial structures before its invasion. I feel very strongly that individual and collective agency absolutely shouldn't be removed from Africa's historical past in students' minds. Dori Tunstall's lecture on African design for the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in 2021 taught me about Asante weights, and it's worth rewatching that lecture with students every year. The Asante weight was made of less precious metals and used to standardize the measurement of gold. This example is from Ghana in the 15th to 18th century. Asante weights show the standardization of both weights and measures and of visual languages in flat pattern. Currency and postage both convey graphic legitimacy, as Lee argues. The Confederate States of America claimed slaveholder George Washington on a postage stamp, for instance, to assert their legitimacy as an American political unit. And this is a claim that students readily interrogate on their own. How do motifs travel as visual languages? Here we look at changes over geographic distance and over time. And when looking at motifs and patterns, talk about how to cite, how to acknowledge what came before, as this can be an important aspect of respectful practice. Hat tip to my PhD mentor, Beverly Brandt, who opened my eyes to how textiles document design history in built environments at many scales and in both 3D and 4D. So think of an inauguration or a religious processional. Many textiles first entered the Western European market from elsewhere. Printed calico from 11th century India, brocade and silk from Neolithic China, and Egyptian twill emerging before First Dynasty Egypt. Colleague Zidi Mathangi taught me a lot about the visual languages of East African Conga cloth at an AIGA Educators Conference in 2013. I then made a point to learn more also about kente cloth. Between these two different kinds of textiles, Conga and kente, they cover a large swath of the African continent. They can use printed mottos, icons, geometric patterns, and political motifs. And the tradition is both historical and ongoing. So Conga, made for Barack Obama's 2009 inauguration, is held by his presidential library. Including textiles in design history brings much more of the design environment into our scope of study. Finally, how might we participate in design histories as sites of generative futures? Recuperative narratives alone will not save us. The iterative, additive process of adding them to our narrative doesn't really have an expiration date, but those stories alone do not make for a full understanding of history. However, every story expands our capacity to understand the past, to act in the present, and to design better futures. For several years, students and I have contributed annotated artifacts to the People's Graphic Design Archive. I estimate I've reviewed some 5,500 annotated artifacts since 2015, before the PGDA even came into official being. I was initially inspired by the Fashion Institute of Technology's Fashion Timeline project, but my deep and ongoing thanks to Breyer Levitt, Louise Sandhaus, and all the public scholars at the PGDA. So, in observing these hundreds, thousands of annotations, I've observed that queer design histories offer a strong example of generative futures. Mae Morris, whose contributions to the arts and crafts movement were long erased, resonates strongly with students, and she's shown up in a fair amount of recent design history scholarship, too. Her gender nonconformity and her feminist activism matter, even now, especially now. She appeared in the published work of my past student Brooke Hull, in an archival research project that carefully attended to the politics of citation. The existence of ancestors matters for teaching and for learning, and a queer presence in design history matters for the discipline. Again, a publication by my former student Gilberto Corona speaks to this notion quite profoundly. Contemporary designers around the world continue the slow work of including queer and BIPOC ancestors in design history. I share here the Queer Craft Catalog, designed a few years ago by Lisa Forsgren, which did some of that work in a context very far removed from my own sphere. In conclusion, pluriversal histories emerge from situated labor. They do not just happen. The hidden collective labor of many design history teachers throughout the first 2 decades of this century undergirds today's more inclusive but still contested disciplinary narratives. I want my story here to make space for many more emergent stories. I imagine myself elbowing aside stories that are taking up too much space on the shelf, making plenty of room for my tiny story to fit, and then immediately giving space away to emergent colleagues. So I end with the question that I always pose to students. What are your design histories and how might you tell them so others can learn from them too? Please be in touch if you want to chat. I would love to talk with you. Goodbye.